All right. Welcome to episode 29 of EchelonOrchid. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Ford, and joining me again, it would have originally been Sunday coffee. Maybe for some of you it's Sunday coffee. Maybe some of you it's happy hour. My good friend, TK Eppley. TK, cheers. I don't know what you're drinking, but I'm drinking some Indian single malt, because.
I just got water right now.
So for these next few episodes, we figured we'd give you all a little bit of history on the Constitution and the amendments. There seems to be a lot of confusion about, both what are rights and what not. We're just going to kind of eventually go in order. But, to me, the Constitution, which I can't tell you how many times I've seen this and heard this where people say the social contract is broken. We don't have one. And I kind of want to I kind of want to hit them over the head with the Constitution and say that is our social contract. Like that is what it is. Last time I checked, the Constitution is still looking pretty damn solid to me and is good. I don't see any reason to be changing it since essentially it was built with the mechanism be living document and change with the will of the people.
That's okay. So there, I think is our first touch point. We have a mechanism to change the Constitution. We have 27 amendments, right? 17 of them are post Constitutional Convention signed. The framers by design said, we want this process to be arduous because we don't want the will of the people, the whim of the people, not the will. We want the will of the people, not the whim of the people. And the whim of the people want stuff now, right? And it's no more evident than today because everybody's got the attention span of whatever their phone does, right? That process to amend the Constitution is arduous for a reason because we want people to be serious about the direction of the country. And because people don't want to wait, now we rely a lot more on case-made law. Then that's where constitutional scholars and jurists like Antonin Scalia would agitate a good portion of the thing because he's like, hey, I don't care whether it's a liberal argument, conservative argument, or whatever, as long as I can tie it to the original text, I'm bound to vote and then speak about it in a certain way because it's the text that matters, not anybody else's feelings. And as Americans today, we're really into our feelings and less about what the long-term success of the republic is.
Yeah, and I think that's a good distinction. The will versus the whim, right? The will is from almost a generational aspect. We have to get a supermajority in the Congress in order to do it, and I believe it's also, if I remember correctly, a supermajority of the states.
Yes. Right. 75% actually. 75% of the states.
Right. Yeah. Supermajority. Yeah.
Right. And so if you look I think the closest one that's meandered around for the last 30, 40 years is the Equal Rights Amendment, which I think is, I personally, it's with 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment or 15th, 16th. I mean, in there, but you've now like, I think it's ceremonial. It's not anything else. Right. But that's like the one that's meandering around that couldn't get over it because for the most part, a lot of times it happens at local legislatures, especially like when we're talking about changing the voting age, presidential succession and things like that, some of the latter amendments. And certainly, I like the whole thing with prohibition, right? We as a nation at one point said, hey, alcohol is really bad. We're not going to do that. And we didn't imagine the second and third order consequences of that. Well, of graft, organized crime, everything that, kind of was really spawned from that, right? And then we had the common sense to change it, right? And so when you look at the Constitution, and I, as somebody who really says, hey, I don't have to agree with all the laws, and I don't have to, and I can be vehemently opposed to some of the things the government does, but as long as it works within the framing of the Constitution, I'm happy with it. And if I'm not, I can go to my congressman, to the government and say, hey, we need to make a law. We need to change the law as it is and run through the process. Right? People don't want to do that anymore. Right? People are like, I'm unhappy with this. I want it changed now. Right? And I don't think we spend enough time in honest discussion, like in schools anymore, with the nuts and bolts of how this works, right? It's why people, we talk about, oh, we're in a democracy. We don't live in a democracy. We live in a constitutional republic, right? Because a true democracy is majority wins. And the Constitution, to a certain extent, especially through the legislative branch, is designed to protect the minority, right? To say, hey, yes, the majority got their way, but there are certain constraints so that you can't get pitchforks and everything out and say, hey, here's the minority, we're going to wipe them off the face of the earth. Right?
Well, to clarify, just so people understand, so it's like talking about whiskey. You got whiskey as being the great grandfather, that's democracy. And then outside of that, you've got scotch, you've got rye, you've got bourbon, you've got single malts, right? So we're down into the branches and talking about constitutional republic. You got to go all the way up because you needed these things in order to be able to get it to where we have a representation of the country. Otherwise, we would never get anything done.
Well, it's funny, having lived in England, and one of the
constitutional monarch.
But having lived in England, one of the nice things you hear about people, like they'll talk about the Constitution. They're like, why do you guys do this? Why do you guys do that? Why do you guys do this? And I'm like, look, essentially the first 10 amendments are, hey, this is what England did to us, and we don't want that. Right? And I said, with the exception of the 9th Amendment, but we want to have freedom of the press. We don't want to quarter troops in our house. We don't want just unrestricted searching of our personal property. All right.
But do we really want, unabridged freedom of the press? Seems like
I'm talking from, like there's the old thing. Remember when certainly when I was a kid, you had Schoolhouse Rock, and they had little I'm just a Bill, and a little Bill with a little belly on him and everything. He's sitting on the steps of Capitol Hill. Having worked in government for a bit, and watching that process, I would always walk out of there going, that song left a whole bunch of stuff out of there. Right? Because it went by, here's what the Constitution says, not the actual politics and how we get from A to B. Right? And I always tell people, if you're unhappy with your foreign policy, go get yourself a new senator. If you're unhappy with the roads, go get yourself a new congressman. All right? It's kind of a distinction of, thing. And people, I think with the 24-hour news cycle, and in particular, the deliberative nature of the Senate in particular has been polluted, right? Because we want to stick microphones in what used to be thoughtful people's faces and demand an answer and demand excellence. And just because we elect somebody to public office doesn't mean they have a considered or smart opinion on everything on the planet, right? And so, to a certain extent, good or bad, we want to get everybody on tape saying something, so at some latter day we can play got you with them, rather than saying, hey, we're all flawed human beings. We're all just, at some point, people used to show up to the government to do service and to help, kind of keep the wheels on the national interest, as it were, and that was to be applauded, right? And now I think it becomes very difficult to be a public official. Right, and to do it well and to do it in a considered fashion, right? Especially when we do muddle the lines of what's constitutionally appropriate, or guaranteed, depending on how you look at that, as opposed to what happens in the real world, right? And some of it happens now at the speed of light, right? And if you think about when the Constitution, when they were writing the Constitution, we were trying to ratify the Constitution, which didn't get fully ratified till 1789, that we were largely a nation of agrarian dumbasses, right? And so what did you have? You had a certain amount of people that read, but the town crier was still alive, right? And so as a news medium, like when you seek and receive information, it was a one-way conversation. Somebody picked out, hey, here's everything that the people need to know. Right. So somebody was already deciding, in today's world, we call that censorship. Right. The thing was like, no, this is all they need to know to get along. Right. And so then it moved to that. Then we became a little bit more educated. And then you had the newspapers. Right. Again, one to many. Right. All the news that's fit to print. Well, who decided it was fit to print? right? And there's just my thoughts on this, and this is for me. It started teaching technology and thinking about how communications have evolved. Then what happened? We got a radio, and prior to what the FCC and everything in the late 1800s, early 1900s in that area, the airwaves were open and everybody had radios, and there was somewhat a measure of open communication for everybody that wanted to do that. And then what a friend of mine calls the first grand theft of the U.S. government was they absconded with the airwaves.
Right.
Right. And they said, bandwidth, we're going to get it. And now they restricted that. And it became, like my grandparents would say, hey, let's go watch the radio. Right. And it became a one-to-many transmission again. Right. You had newspaper barons and thing. And, then when television came out, just by virtue of expense, the use of equipment, how it was always going to be one-to-many. And when we were kids, half an hour every night, right? Walter Cronkite used to sit there and tell you 3 stories, right? Three things were important during the day. If you really wanted to know in-depth news, you had to read a newspaper. And then they used to tell you what the stock market was. And then you'd be on your way back to what went on, right? Now, you look at the internet. We have the greatest tool at our disposal ever invented to go and research information, right? And I ask people all the time, I said, do you watch the news for affirmation or information? Right? Like, liberal friends of mine, I would never watch Fox News. Conservative friends of mine, I'd never watch MSNBC. All right, why? Right? I want to hear from everybody. I don't agree with them. And that's, I think, when I think of the founders, like Thomas Jefferson said, my disagreements with another man has never been an occasion to hate him. Right? Paraphrase, right? And that's a big thing we've lost, and we've lost it everywhere. And we couldn't, you couldn't have you could have people argue and create a constitution today. And we can argue or not whether this is the best way to do government, right? But it's our way, right? And with that, could we create a document like this today? And more importantly, how do we properly amend that document, right? Because nothing is about pushing the bus forward right now. It's about saying, hey, I win. It's a finite game, right? You either win or you lose, right? And there's no middle ground to say, hey, everybody gave a little and we did what's right for the nation, right? Reagan, collaborated with Tip O'Neill to work with the Speaker of the House. Clinton collaborated with Newt Gingrich when the Republicans took over the House in '94, right? There's zero collaboration right now, right? It's how, I'm not giving anybody anything that can be interpreted as a win, right? And, in my lifetime, I've seen 2 presidents, one of each party, have the other party's secretary or Speaker of the House stand on the White House lawn and they introduce things together, right? Until we can do something like that, right? Where it's not a battle for my soul every time I turn on the television, that makes it hard to do things constitutionally accurately because everybody's got emotion in it and you're not being able to reference the founding document. And the founding documents are hard, right? Like this is like, that's like, and let's just like you start with the First Amendment, free speech. Free speech says this, that I have to sit there and listen to you if I absolutely despise everything you say. And then I have the opportunity to go defend my opinion for the rest of my life. Right? And do that. But it all starts with, you have to be willing to listen to somebody that disagrees with you without canceling them, shouting them down, throwing a Molotov cocktail at them, physically intimidating them. Right? Or just saying, hey, we're not going to put you on television.
From the aspect of politicians, we have the last, 2 sitting presidents, both of which I don't feel did a very good job in collaboration, which was really when the internet really took a boom. But if we go all the way back, even to the very beginning, you mentioned, that the Constitution not being ratified wasn't ratified for many years afterwards. And how it wound up getting done is because, the people who are considered the founding fathers, they didn't agree. They didn't agree on a lot of it. And it wasn't until, the Federalist Papers and Alexander Hamilton having to go around and politic to get people to buy in.
Right.
Because it's give and take. In a negotiation, both parties have to feel like they came across as a winner. Otherwise, they're not going to want to negotiate with you next time.
Yeah.
And that's an art that I feel has severely been handicapped and or lost in today's political landscape because of social media.
There's and I mean, we could go off on a tangent for the rest of this thing on how that happens within the media, but with the advent of television, and then the fact that the news had advertising creep into it, right? Once you had commercials and now you found a way to monetize the news, this is just that on steroids from when television, the 1950s, when television became an item that was in a significant portion of the American household, right? That was considered a middle-class thing, is to be able to have a television, right? And once you said, hey, we are going to pay people, we're going to pay for that news, which is effectively when they started taking money for advertising. Now there was competition between each channel, right? And that, I think, it all sprouted out of a need to say, hey, we want, because all of the powers that be within the television industry effectively were given the airwaves. You can have that segment of the airwaves and all that stuff, but you have to do at least 30 minutes of public interest programming a day. And that turned into news. Well, in order, if I'm running a business and somebody says I have to do something that mostly costs me money, if you don't outline how I have to do it cost free, then I'm going to go out and find a way to monetize it. And they did. And then I think when, CNN, and that's certainly around the time of the first Gulf War in the early 90s, where CNN had, the 24 hour, I think, I hate to say it, I don't say it this way to be callous to veterans of that conflict, but it saved CNN, right? Because now there was a reason to be on 24 hours a day. And then OJ happened. All of a sudden there's all this they figured out how to do it in its cycle, and it was through sensationalizing it, I think, right? And a lot of that drives, the lack of considered discourse, because we got to fill up 24 hours a day, right? If you go to sports, right, that's why you would joke around about ESPN Ocho, right? Because we're going to have cornhole tournaments on, because we got to fill up 24 hours a day, right? I don't like watching cornhole at picnics when I'm live, right? It's like, maybe it's just me, right? But what
I am like Patrick Mahomes on the State Farm commercial with cornhole.
What's that?
I'm kind of like Patrick Mahomes during the State Farm where he's playing.
No doubt. Yeah. But that's, to me, it's that mentality of, it's the ESPN Ocho. When you've got the main tier channel of CBS, NBC, ABC, and Fox, and then each one of them have 6 sub networks underneath them times 24.
Yeah.
Right. And that's, when you start looking at it, because like I said, I don't think that, and this is not in certain school districts, it's different, but how much time do we spend actually teaching the Constitution as it exists, not as we think it should be, right? And it's like, I don't want your opinion, I want the facts. And I advocate that everybody get in there and start, not just read the Constitution. There's enough great books out there that dissect the Constitution, and they do it through the lens of writings of the participants who were trying to craft it at the time. And that historical reference back and forth to how to do it has always been amazing to me.
Yeah. So I brought up here, the First Amendment, and this is, breaking this down. The first thing that comes to mind is, how is New York not having a bunch of lawsuits against them for what they're doing to the Jewish community? Like, they are literally prohibiting the gathering of, for freedom, or they're preventing the gathering of religious expression right now.
Right. And here's the thing. It's not that they're even doing it out in public, right? They're now, I saw on the news last night or 2 days ago, they're actually knocking on doors and going into people's homes and saying, hey, you have too many people in here worshiping, right? That's That's what happens in totalitarian countries, right? That's not who we are as Americans. And I don't care what faith people are practicing. You know, if you want to worship a head of lettuce and call him Ralph, and he's thing, as long as you have faith, right? Worship whoever you want. That's what this country is founded on, right? But just like everything else, we have a whole lot of rights in this country guaranteed by the Constitution. Who is going to execute the responsibility that comes along with that, right? And right now, with, you know, even when we start taking, you know, the people talk in terms of freedom from religion now, not freedom of religion, right? And bringing up, my personal opinion is bringing up anything of faith in a public school is not endorsing one religion or another. All right. And I'll just say, because for those of you that have seen us on this before, most of you know my kids either have went or go to Catholic school. And when my son was, and he graduated quite a while ago, when my son was in high school, they used to have comparative religions, all right, as a class that the kids took. They don't have that anymore, because during my son's time there, and the kids do it, he came home and he goes, "Dad, I don't think I believe in God." I'm like, "All right, what do you believe in?" And he goes, "Well, what do you mean?" I go, "Well, you don't consider yourself to be the supreme being, do you?" All right. You have to have faith. You have to believe in things that you can't see and you can't touch. All right. That's how you become great as a human being. And he said, "No." He goes, I think I want to check out Buddhism." And I'm like, "All right." And you remember Andrew that used to work with us on Circle? He worked for me at Blackboard. His wife was Thai, really devout Buddhist. And I said, "Well, let's go talk to her." All right. Well, apparently I was one of the parents that I thought that was kind of cool, that he was thinking outside, you know, trying to think bigger than just himself and say, "I want to explore other things." Well, a lot of the parents are like, "That's not what we're paying for at Catholic school." Right. And so they don't teach that class anymore. But when you send your kids to any school of faith, whether it's Catholic, Jewish, everything, you expect, like, you know, the kids have theology class, right? They go to that every year, and it's an expectation when your children go there. But in a public school, to say, "Hey, we're going to talk about all religions," and yet people come in and say, "Oh, you can't talk about religion at all," that's freedom from religion, not freedom of religion, right? And I think that, you know, how we narrowly extrapolate what we like to have versus what it says, that's when we go off the rails.
Yeah, you know, and it's interesting to me, because how do you talk about world history without talking about religion and the religions of the world?
You can't. You simply cannot, right? There's no, tell me how there's a way to do that.
I can't think of one, because
anybody, Bueller.
You've got the Buddhist temple in China, in terms of, you know, what they did during the Qin dynasty was essentially created. You know, it's not possible. You can't separate them. You can talk about it without, or at least minimizing your biases of religion, by talking about, you know, the facts that we know as we know them.
Think about the Catholic Church's effect on history. Think about Islam's effect on history. Right. And think about, like, in that part of the world, going from, you know, effectively from Constantinople back and forth between there and Europe, what with architecture, history, people, like, you know, go do 23andMe. And if you're Italian or Eastern European, you are going to most likely have some measure of Arabic, somebody from an Arab country in your past. Just like if you live in England, you're most likely going to have somebody with Nordic blood, right? Because of people moving around. And most of it was done at one point or another under the cause of religion, right? I mean, the Catholic, when Luther invaded, you know, Rome and went to the Vatican, right? There's still, you know, etched in the walls of the Sistine Chapel, Luther, right? But it was politics, it was industry, it was, you know, what were the Templar Knights about? They were the revenue collectors.
Yeah.
Right. And with that system, it didn't matter where it was. And that was the first, how those systems work. But you're totally correct. We can't, a lot of the first immigrants into what became the United States, right, when it was just a colony, why were they leaving wherever they came from? They were seeking religious freedom. That's how the Quakers did it, right?
Yep.
You know, that I'll say it this way. They kept to themselves, but they also did not want to fundamentally, as long as we had freedom of religion, we'll tolerate everything else the U.S. does. We just want to be able to practice our faith, right? Now it's, hey, I want to practice my faith, or I don't want to practice any faith, and I want everybody else to do it. And it's what I say to folks that get a little overzealous with religion, is you not doing something because you believe it's against your faith is really cool. You telling me not to do something because you believe it's against your faith is not cool at all, right? And that's the difference. You talking to me about it to try to get me to change my position on something, First Amendment, freedom of speech, right? And we can have a discourse and I can disagree with you. And then we go get something to eat and have fun, right? You know, and bygones, right? However you want to do that. But that, I think some of the nuance that we've lost as a nation.
Yeah, we definitely have. And it's, you know, it really, especially when it comes to that, the religious side, you know, or the no religion side, it, you know, almost everything today seems to be of a cult-like following. Because if you don't believe the way they are, then they, you know, cast you out.
Right.
Of God, right? You're gone. Hey, you're gone. And to me, that's kind of what a cult does. Right? You're either all.
It's not kind of what a cult does. It's exactly what a cult does.
Yeah. Well. Right. So I'm going. Wait a minute. Then you know, this is, you know, the amount of cult-like behavior that we have now is really disturbing to me. Because I you know, this is where, you know, when people, when they say, hey, you're voting libertarian, you're throwing your vote away. No, I'm trying to vote for what I want the country to look like 40 years from now.
Right.
And I don't believe that it's going to look the way I want it if we keep voting just the same, you know, Republican and Democrats that continue to be there. I think they're the same. They're just two sides of the same coin at this point.
They're all both sides of the same coin shouting at their base.
Right. And you know, I just, you know, those things, you know, they bother me. So, you know, now again, if a, you know, even though I didn't necessarily agree with everything Tulsi Gabbard had to say, I would have still voted for her. I think she's a you know, in the middle. Maybe, you know, Dan Crenshaw winds up running. You know, I was listening to Joe Rogan podcast, and he had one of his one of Dan Crenshaw's buddies on, who was Air Force, or no, he was a West Point guy, flew Apache helicopters. And a really funny thing, he says, you know how you can tell if someone's an Apache helicopter pilot? And he's like, no, how's that? He goes, we'll tell you.
Exactly. Yeah, no doubt.
I thought that was pretty funny, but you know,
it's like CrossFitters, right?
Yeah.
A CrossFitter, a vegan, and a yoga instructor walk into a bar. Everybody knows in 5 minutes how. They tell everybody.
You know, we've gotten everything off to these extremes, and I always felt that the Constitution was to try to eliminate the extremes and get people into the norms.
Yes.
And it's like we've thrown that out the window.
Right. Well, yeah, no doubt. Right. And it's almost like it's the gamification.
Yeah.
Right. We've got to have, it's got to be some big thing. Everything's got to be a big deal. You know, most people, it's not a big deal. Don't try to tell me what to do with too much extreme. And don't shout me down every time I say I enjoy something or I don't enjoy something. And we're at that inflection point right now where that seems to be what everybody wants to do. And you're not, like, I mean, the great thing about the amendment, or the Constitution in general, but when you start talking about the amendments, is they are so plainly written, right? It says, hey, we're not going to make any law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, right? What, like, anybody, like, how can you parse that into you can't talk about religion in public? Right? I mean, I tend to understand why the crowd that wants to do that. But from a functional, like a nuts and bolts, hey, how do we stray away from this as a government when it's that plainly written? And think about it, it was plainly written because we were a nation of farmers at the time. And you want to go, oh yeah, that makes sense. I can do that. That's easy. Right. But over the years, we've we've done that in one way or another, right? And yes, in large measure, we have kind of grown as a nation, founding as a Christian nation, right? But we've been accepting of other faiths. And you have to say that as a nation, because you can't say that about individuals, because there's dumbasses everywhere, right? And it's, I fear you because you're different, right? And I've said this to you before. I might have even said it, or we've been talking on the show before, is if you don't want to be ignorant, read. If you don't want to be a racist, travel. Because once you start traveling and you meet other people and you get to see other cultures, number one, you're going to go, everybody else is pretty cool too. And more importantly, America is the worst place to live until you leave America. And you find out everybody wants to come here, right? Why? Largely because of the founding document. If I'll give you an example, like if you grew up in Kosovo and you get involved in what they call the American school system, where everybody learns how to speak English and they go to school speaking English in class every day of the week, and it starts early. I was at a restaurant one night when I was there the last time, and we had I was sitting at the bar talking to the people that own the place, because it was right across from the office where I was working. And a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old came up to me, 2 little girls. They were really cute little girls. And they both started speaking English, perfect American English with American slang and everything. I thought I was talking to 2 little American kids. Their parents spoke passable English, but they want their children to have the benefit of the American school system there, right? And they know more about the Constitution. They know more about our founding documents and how we got there, aside from and they compare it against their own system, right? And the other thing is it allows them to say, we also understand what America cannot be, right? And because there are things like, why is no other country, recently free nations, adopted anything but effectively, parliamentarian system, because it's a much more easy, like to grow from ground up. It's much easier to do, right? And you're still having free elections and all the other things like that, right? And a lot of it, at some point, the British, had a significant influence on what a large portion of the world did. Right? And it rolled down that we like the parliamentarian system. So it fascinates me.
What people don't get is that, for the United Kingdom, for them to get the type of democracy they have today, took them 600 years.
Yeah.
Right. The United States and, you could say Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and, some other countries that England or the United Kingdom had an influence on, was because we learned it from them.
Right.
Some adopted the exact system. We said, no, screw you. We're going to do it our own way, and made it more difficult. But, the parliamentary system is simpler for people to understand.
Right.
We go ahead and get it and say, all right, we, started off with something where we were like, we know we like this. This guy, Johnny Locke, he kind of knew what he was doing. So we're going to take that and adopt it.
Right.
That he thought was a little bit better coming from that aspect. And we modified the parliamentary system to make it to where we weren't going to have a king, which is what everything went away from. But I would still say today the parliamentary system is better, but it only works if you have to actually play politics. You have to negotiate. If you only have 2 parties in parliament, guess what you have?
Right.
Republican.
Most of even in England, you effectively got 3. You've got the Conservatives, the Tories, the Liberals, and the Liberal Democrats, which is more of a libertarian, right? I think they've lost a lot of influence since Patty Ashdown stepped down and thing, but I think there's right now, and I could be wrong by 1 or 2, I think there's 4 different political parties in the Kosovo parliament right now. Right. And so they have to form a coalition. They have to work together. Earth is flat. You need to blame nice. Is that one of your friends?
Hey, if you're gonna send me stupid stuff, it's getting put on air.
Just play stupid games, win stupid prizes. That's right. Flat.
Yeah, this is why the world chooses parliament. Well, I think it was Winston Churchill that said, democracy is the worst form of government. It's just better than all the rest.
Yes, exactly.
It doesn't mean you can't have corruption. It doesn't mean you're going to make great decisions. It doesn't mean that you're going to choose the right politician to represent you. It just means you actually have a say in what's going to happen. It's not done by.
We literally, our politicians are allowed to vote themselves pay raises.
Yeah.
Right. And they don't have to put it out to a thing. Now, I also think that envy drives a lot of what we do in America today. They're like, oh, that guy, average congressman makes, I think it's 184 grand a year. People are like, that's an insane amount of money. Well, I'm going to submit that most of the folks that are in Congress legitimately could be making more than that. And we should be asking a tremendous amount of our elected officials to deliver for us. And we don't anymore. We don't man that. But to have a congressman with their salary, their staff salary, and everything is relatively cheap. It's roughly, and I could be wrong in thinking, but I know years ago, it used to be 83 cents for every voter in every district. It's up over $1 now, right? But about $1.50, maybe even $2. Let's just say $5 of your tax dollars goes to have the congressman and their staff and offices and everything, which is relatively cheap. So it's not the act of having a Congress is not expensive. It's what they do that's expensive. And that's where people, that's where people lose their minds. That when people are showing up 40, 50, 60 hours a week to make ends meet, and I don't think that Congress has competently explained everything because it appears that they're not legislating, right? And by calling them legislators, then we say they've got to make new laws, right? That to complete that function, we're paying you to make new laws. Well, how many more can we make, right? How many more are necessary, right? And we've lost the concept of legislative restraint because people want to go back to their districts and say, I'm putting X amount of $1 million into the district. I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And they never do it as a straight vote for, hey, put this money to this project. It's part of the art of politics is, hey, yeah, we'll do this really cool thing, this really good thing for the nation over here, but we're going to bury a bunch of this other stuff in it to guarantee that it'll get passed, right? I'm going to get what I want, and we're going to put it in a bill that nobody will not vote for because it's political suicide for a third or 2/3 of the folks that are going to have to vote for it.
Yeah.
Right. And that knows no party. Right. And that's when you say they're on both sides of the same coin is the system is set up to keep incumbents in office, right? The way that it functions is very hard for somebody to break in and get in and get into past an incumbent, right? It's just not, you do 2 or 3 terms in Congress, unless you're completely malfeasant and stop going to your district, you're going to get reelected. Like now we got Mark Warner here in Virginia. He said when he ran the first time, he said, I pledge not to run for more than 2 terms. He's going to win. And he's going to win his 3rd term.
Short-term memory loss.
Well, people don't care. It's not like we don't expect anything from politicians, right? So if you don't expect things from people, they're going to deliver it every time. And so we have a very low expectation, right? And that low expectation, and it's combined traditionally with very low voter turnout, leads to the government that we have, right? And you'll hear people complain about it all the time. You're like, did you vote? No. Okay, be quiet then, all right? Which, and actually, this is the topic I'll talk about all day long, is voter registration and getting to the point where we have statistically full participation, right? Because you're not going to get everybody, but statistically you can say, hey, at 85%, we're at full participation, right? We're looking at the process of registration and the process of ease of voting backwards, right? The government, Congress in particular, right? Because this is where it should come from. I mean, the presidency by design, the executive branch by design is is largely powerless to affect change. The advantage of the presidency is the bully pulpit of the presidency. When the executive branch sends a budget over to Congress, it's a request. It's like, hey, here's what we think is important, right? Please take it into consideration, right? Because if you go into the Constitution, the president has no authority to do that. He has to go ask Congress to pass laws. That's why they have giant staffs that go to the Hill and they say, hey, we want to do this. And they work through their party's legislative affairs people to get this stuff in and get it in churning in, right? The responsibility of the relationship between the Congress and the executive branch is to understand beforehand the negotiated process of I'm going to veto this or I'm not going to veto this, right? That's the big stick the president and the executive branch have. So it's not like the president can say, hey, I want full participation in voting, and it magically happens. In the 21st century, if you truly want legitimate one ballot, one vote, or one person, one vote, technically the means are fairly easy. And you just have to have the will, right? Because it is going to be a lift, right? Because motor voter law made it easier to register to vote. And and I believe we made it easier to vote in a legitimate fashion. Because think about how many different pieces of information you have to show up with at the DMV to get a license or an ID, right?
A lot.
Right. And so we record, especially like now with Real ID. I mean, you got to do everything but a stool sample when you show up to when you go get the Real ID. All right. Technically, we have the means to make it very easy. When I'm seeing on here with all the paper ballots and mail-in ballots, and they're saying, "Oh, the president is pulling up mailboxes." No. The U.S. Postal Service does not work for the president, and nothing happens quickly in the government. Why are they pulling up post office boxes? Because nobody mails shit anymore. Every year, the number of pieces of legitimate mail, like bills and summons, everything, all that stuff goes down. Why? Because we're replacing it with electronic means. Right?
It's true.
We have to have the will to say, hey, if we have to build kiosks, right, to vote on the day. Right? If we have whatever we have to do as a nation to guarantee that the people have access to vote and they have it as quickly as possible. And, like now for the voting ahead of the day, not all the precincts are open, right? So in Virginia Beach, for example, there's a couple of places around town, but on my side of town, it's at the city center. And they're like, oh, you got to wait in line for an hour. Well, yes, because there's one place to vote. I guarantee you show up and every polling place is open. I'll wait 10 minutes, maybe like I did in 2016 when I voted. All right. But this concept of we consistently make it hard, and we say that having an ID can be racist, isn't necessary or anything else. How else do we legitimize an election? Right? Do we do like in India where like they put like a blue indelible blue ink so it lasts like a week or so you get that on your right index finger to prove that you voted, right? Technology wise, how hard would it be to do it on a smartphone and do it legitimately?
Right? It's not hard. I mean,
it's not hard at all. We just have to want to do it, and we don't want to do it, and that's the disturbing thing to me.
Even if we went which I would still say this is archaic, right? An ATM can take a check that you deposit, and regardless of which check bank this came from, it can tell you with a reasonable amount of certainty, I would say even more than reasonable, as to what the dollar amount that's being deposited into your account, and it knows when. So if we already know what a ballot looks like, and someone wanted that, there's a couple different ways they could print it off at home. They know what the ballot looks like. They put in their driver's license, because they all have some type of either mag swipe at this point or a way of being able to grab the identification, put in your ballot, and it's going to total it up right away. To me, would still be archaic. And what's sad about that, it is still better than what we have most places today.
Right. I mean, that's the thing to me is like and that's the will of the nation, right? That's the will of the government to say, hey, I get it. I hear what you're saying, American people, that we feel disenfranchised for whatever reason, right? Across the spectrum. Whatever your bitch is, I want to help, right? But how do we do that so that it's the least amount of friction possible? Right? We're not in a place where everybody has to walk up. I kind of enjoy it. I kind of hold the whole going and pulling the lever, so to speak, as it were. Right? But we're not in a place where we have to do that. So whether we do it through the use of technology, right? And it's like anything else. It's technology and law, right? If you want to talk about healthcare, right? And people say, oh, well, if we repeal ACA, then the pre-existing conditions thing is going to go away. Guess what? Get in a room, write a law that doesn't and basically account for pre-existing conditions. And do this. Like none of this stuff is rocket science. It's the will of the people and the will of Congress to get shit done. Right. But again, it comes back to that. Who's going to get the win for that?
Yeah.
And that's the hard part.
We can do in order to ensure that pre-existing conditions are kept manageable prices is that if you're a health insurance company, you can no longer be publicly tradable. You have to be a not-for-profit.
Right. I mean, but like I said, like I agree with you. But like I said, there's a plethora of options across the board to solve these problems, but it becomes will of. When we start talking about something as important as voting, and you said, we want to talk about how we're going to decide the fate of the nation for the next 20, 30, 40 years, it happens in every Congress by the laws that they write.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's easy to get one passed. It's hard to get them repealed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so how do we do that, right? And so when you talk about voting, the fundamental thing we do, how do we do that and how do we do it legitimately? And put smart tech people in the rooms, put social scientists in the room. Somebody tell me why X is happening and Y isn't, right? And those things, that's how you get it done. But like you look at India, when they had their first thing, they went out in rural India, and I'm like, in like almost, into the Himalayas type thing, and built kiosk and made it, you remove the excuse where people can't vote. Hey, why every 4 years, why do we work on that day, right? If we're saying right now the bulk of American people work, and we're going to say the polls are open from 7 in the morning to 7 at night, well, most people go to work at 8 and they get off at 5:30, 6 o'clock. So yeah, you're limited. You're constricting the ability of people's time to vote. Day off, done.
And as you say that, I'm kind of thinking, because at one point in time, the only people who could vote were landowners. You had to own land. And so,
and in a really effed up twist, they were also allowed to vote for people that lived on their property, whether they were there forcibly or not. Right? So, they were, and it's how we accounted for slaves.
Yeah.
Right?
This is just a modern day way of still enforcing only landowners get to vote.
Right.
Because worker bee, hey, you got to be there or you lose your job. Is that just a modern way of doing it?
Yeah, it comes down to like, I got to put food on the table and I got to pay rent and I got to do everything else. And my boss is like, no, you got to be here on time. And then I got to go pick my kids up after school. I got to do, there's all the associated things that go on with this. And there's times when we can move very swiftly as a nation to use modern conveniences to the best of what we can do. And there's other times where we just put our head in the sand and say, no, this is the way it's always been. So we've got to do that. Right. Well, like daylight savings time, like why? Like Europe's done 21. Like we're not doing this anymore. All right. Geronimo, when they tried to explain, to the great Indian chief Geronimo, what daylight savings time was about, so shortly before he passed away, his response was only the white man could cut a foot off a blanket, sew it onto the other end, and think he got another foot. The blanket became a foot longer.
Yeah.
Right.
True.
But some of this stuff is just no brainers, and we can't seem to get out of our own way because it's what we've always done. Well, we used to sail ships. Now we have nuclear power. Like let's take all that out and put the sails back on the aircraft carriers and see how that works.
Hey, and if AOC gets her way, it's going to be done on solar energy.
It's going to be what?
Solar energy for those ships.
Yeah. Yeah. other than some basic science there, I'm looking, yeah, sure. Other than some immutable laws of physics, perfect.
Yeah, I mean I mean that's kind of how I feel about a lot of these energy people that come up. Like it's just I don't think they quite understand that no matter what you do to get energy, you're still going to deplete from the earth. It doesn't.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we were talking about this earlier, right? You know, since the Paris Climate Accord, that's the kind of the bellwether for people that want to talk about this stuff. You know, we've continued on this glide slope of a lower carbon footprint. China and India and other countries have not. In India, over the years, has made a great statement about what they're going to do in the name of climate change and what they're unwilling to do. And one of the things that they've said is, so wait a second, you're going to tell me at the turn of the 20th century, the U.S. was belching crap into the air as fast as we could, and polluting the earth as fast as they could to become the industrial mega power that they became, to cement your place on the planet. And now we don't have the same opportunity. All right? I got to listen to that guy. Right? But if you look at it, there's not going to be new coal-fired power plants built in the U.S., but there's going to be thousands built overseas. And I think some of the fundamental argument flaws that we have in the whole climate change argument is that we have to do it overnight, right? Or that it can be done overnight without being financial suicide for whatever nation does it, and that we can do it autonomously, right? You can lead the way, but if the offsets are we go down and China goes up or China stays the same, you know, globally, it's not like we can fix the U.S. and now there's a donut or a dome over the U.S. and we're done, right? The other piece of this is, what does that do to our independence as a nation? Right? We have the ability to basically take care of ourselves, right? We have the ability to be, energy independent, financially independent, food independent, right? We have damn near every ecosystem in the U.S. at our disposal to, from growing mangoes to growing corn to getting apples out of the Northwest and out of the Northeast, right? And everything in between. Right. And what are we going to do to do that? Because if you want to go get all the lithium for the batteries that we're going to use, that's ugly to the earth. That's tremendously ugly to the earth. All right. You can agree or disagree with fracking, but natural gas is the next cleaner step towards being totally clean. And we have to continue on that glide slope. We can't just fall off the cliff and hope it's going to magically work, right? And get people to commit to that, right? How many buses do you see running around major towns now in the U.S., major cities, metropolitan areas, where all the buses are natural gas?
Quite a bit.
Right? Yeah. Why? Because it reduces the carbon footprint demonstrably, right? Ford for years for work trucks like F-150s, like fleet type trucks, they've had the two, it's a multi-fuel vehicle, and they've got you open up one fuel door and it's the little natural gas, detent, you just plug the hose in, and then the other one's a traditional fuel hole, right? So if the problem again is we come down to it, it's all or nothing, right? And nothing in life, very, very rarely, hey, don't touch kids. That's all or nothing, right? And the rest of it is we have to have a discussion about it. We have to be willing to meet in the middle. And the middle, and I think when we start talking about the environment, because there's a guy, Dan Pena, he's a billionaire. The guy is a riot on YouTube. He is an F-bomb, C-word using dude. He's a billionaire. And he is thinking, somebody stood up and they said, well, the sea level is going to rise 10 feet in 13 years. We're all going to, parroting the big, we got to have the green initiative. And he says, no. He's like, in his thing, he's like, that's the dumbest effing thing I've ever heard. And she tried to keep talking. And he goes, ma'am, you've already told me what your position is. Let me tell you why you're wrong. And he's like, look, it's a simple math problem. He goes, if we scientifically could prove that sea level was going to rise 10 feet in the next even 20 years or 30 years. And he's giving it a longer runway. He's like, that pushes the edge of the ocean in the US back hundreds of miles in some places, right? Florida is off the map, right? In all these places, he goes, think about this. If that was the case and it was scientifically verifiable, there's not one insurance company in America that would indemnify a home for a 30-year mortgage. He's like, it wouldn't happen. It flat out would not happen. And people were laughing at him. And it's like, no, follow the money. Like we tell people, follow the money. If an insurance company is still willing to indemnify a home, they're not doing it because they want to lose money. All right. The federal government did not have to make a considerable drug deal with the big medical industry, right, to get ACA passed. They didn't have to. Why did they have to make considerable concessions and exempt most of the Fortune 50 and Fortune 500 companies? Because they couldn't get it passed. Right? Those are the things like people like think when people tell you that, like, look at what's going on ancillary to that, and they go, does that make sense? Right? And I'm not telling you how to vote on any issue, right? I'm telling people to be independent in their thought, not just pick one channel. I don't care which one channel you pick, you're not getting the full story. Right? And those are the things that drive me nuts. If I hear stuff like on Twitter, on social, I'll get, okay, here's some news item. Then I go here's a left-leaning site, here's a right-leaning site, here's some sensible people in the middle that I trust their opinion. And then you start to make your own educated opinion about it. Right? And for the most part, and it's worse the older people get, right? Because you get set in your ways, so to speak. But like I said, if you've got a few things that are immutable, like, hey, don't touch kids, right? And then from there, you have to become more tolerant of things. The one thing we have to be more tolerant of is change and saying, hey, yes, we agree that this over time is not good for us as a nation, as a species, as a world, whatever it is. But we don't have to throw everything we become as humanity out to accomplish that one goal under the guise of fear. And if you notice, when you start talking about the climate, it used to be global cooling in the 70s and it was global warming. Well, now it's starting to cool down a little bit again from everything I've been told and what you read, right? Well, now we just do climate change. Well, okay, it's going to change. Is that $32 trillion worth of change required? And if we did that, is that going to guarantee the problem's over? And I submit it's not, because we don't live in a vacuum. We live in a global world, right? We live in a global economy. And what happens the reason that if you look at the soil of Puerto Rico and what makes it rich and fertile is it gets it from Africa, right? And the way that things move. And what happened in World War II, right?
Nazis.
What did the Japanese? What was the only thing to ever happen on the effective act of violence from the Japanese? They had these like balloon incendiaries, and a couple of them made it to the Pacific Northwest. Right? Why? Because they understood how the jet stream worked. They understood weather, right? And if you're in that global, and whether it's the economy or anything, think about it. We're interconnected today like we've never been as a global species, right? And this is what freaks out a lot of people too, is as a nation, do we maintain our independence while being a full service participant in the global discussion? And we as Americans have the ability to work over and piss off everybody on the planet because of our perceived independence. Right. And a lot of that perception is on the individual level, by the way. It's not on a nation state level. Right. But I think, to me, those are the important things. Like before we can comment on how we're going to go spend trillions of dollars on the environment. I mean, there's some sensible things to do. Like, hey, stop chucking plastic in the water. Right. You don't see that Native American guy in commercials crying anymore on the side of the road. Right. Because when I was a kid, I grew up in the Northeast where it was plastics and paper. And in one river, you used to be able to tell what color frisbees were coming out by what color the river was. And in another river, you could tell what color paper they were printing. Like those days have been gone. They've been gone for 30, 40 years now. Right. But a lot of the things that we do are more imperceptible. They're not to the human eye. Right. How do we manage that? And how do we do it in a way that doesn't destroy the economy of this nation? Right. Those are the hard things. And I think kind of to tie it back is the farther away we get from thinking about what the founders thought and how to manage all that. Because you can say, how did it start and where are we at now? And how do we keep to that tradition, right? That's the beautiful thing about tradition. They don't have to be, it doesn't have to be black or white. It's some blend depending on what it is, right? Because how many people do you know that are absolutely conservative or absolutely liberal on every issue? Very few, right? You see them on the news every day, but that's 5 to 10% on either end of that 100% spectrum, right? Everybody has shades of gray moving towards the middle.
Well, if you believe with what all they put on social media, then you would think a lot of these people would be either strictly conservative or strictly liberal. But, you know, I happen to know a lot of them in real life and know that that's not
right
everything.
Well, I mean, you just look in the media, you know, when they're on that, whichever channel they were on, how many people have floated back and forth between Fox and MSNBC and Fox and CNN, right? And they just go back and that's the next place they work, right? And so to me, today, that's what's disheartening about the media to me is you just get to see this piece. And anybody that starts having a conversation and wants to say something that is controversial because it's not really controversial. It's like, hey, why don't we just come to the middle and we'll do 2 of those things and 3 of those things over here. We'll call it a day and things will work better. Well, who won? The American people won. Let's try that for a second. Right? You know, I think that's the crazy part about it.
Yeah, it is. Well said. Well, I think that's a good note for us to end today on.
I do.
Hopefully the American people will win.
I want to do Second and Third Amendment next week.
Absolutely.
Because if you take away the second, I want to take away the third for everybody and see how they enjoy that. So everybody out there, go look up the Third Amendment because most people only know a couple of them anyway. So let's go bang that out. But everybody else have a great week.
Absolutely. All right, my friend. Take care.
Yeah.
See you.